Thanks, Mr. Moderator. And I mean, it's great to hear the comments from the minister and Ibrahim and Natalie. I think there's certainly some consensus about this. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is the story so far on climate finance, public climate finance, a little bit on quality, and then say something about the outlook, especially at COP this year. And I guess sort of the introductory text to the panel said, well, what are the motivations for climate finance? And I sometimes think there are two motivations that get mixed together. So one is that lower income countries struggle to borrow at reasonable rates. We know this problem in development for a long time, but with climate, we've all got the whole world has a big interest in getting that right. So there's that angle to it, and then there's the other angle, which the other panelists have mentioned as well, which is the fact that industrialized countries have created huge damage already to the planet, and the polluter needs to pay. So we did. I mean, Ibrahim mentioned some figures on this, and we've done some work on this, but we think that damage so far, just taking OECD countries, amounts to about $4,500 per person in those OECD countries, and that adds up to 34 trillion, which is, so this is a very significant amount of damage that has been done, and so those two motivations combined should mean that we're talking about very significant resources. But then when we come onto the story so far, I mean, it's interesting that we have this panel following the SDGs, and that Natalie should say, we need to break down these silos between climate and development, because I think if you look at the climate and development finance envelope, in the 2000s there was very little development finance that was climate related. The new target was created the climate finance target was created in 2009. According to the OECD countries, 115 billion was provided in 2022. But when you look at the fiscal effort of the countries over that period, it hasn't changed. So the climate and development finance in terms of fiscal effort is 0.3% of GNI. It was that in 2009, and it was that in 2022. So industrialized countries are not putting more resources into this. What they're doing is using the face value inflation and GNI growth to allocate more to climate. And we've done some analysis to show that actually a third of that 100 billion figure has really been diverted from other development objectives. So there's no new resources have gone into the system to support the 100 billion goal. And then there's this point on quality, and the quality of that finance, where I think you can see that there's so many things wrong with the quality of the finance. I mean, one of them is disbursement. We did a review of the EU's climate finance. They'd actually dispersed less than half of the amount they'd committed over a 10-year period. So there was nearly $15 billion of climate finance that was committed but not dispersed, and only 13.6 billion that had been dispersed. But this is also a wider problem in terms of climate finance quality. If you look at what we know about what works in climate finance, it's a relatively new modality, but we know very little compared to, say, health and education. If you look at the 3IE database, which is a kind of repository of high quality evidence, there are 13,000 studies in that, and only 211 of them relate to climate finance. So in terms of what works, there needs to be a huge effort to scale up evaluation and results management. Other colleagues on the panel have talked about the adaptation focus and the focus in loans, which partly goes back to the way that those funds have been provided. And I guess, Ibrahim, you're now in charge of the loss and damage fund. I mean, that's a great example. I agree both that it was a massive achievement to achieve that at the Egypt COP. But what was so ironic to me was everybody that pledged money to it did so from their existing aid budgets, almost by definition. So the EU in particular, it has a fixed envelope of concessional finance, and the loss and damage fund wasn't new money. It was just moving an existing budget, an allocation, if you like, and there is value in that. But it means that there's no more resources to deal with climate and development. So where are we going next? And the minister gave a great summary of where we are on the new collective climate goal, and there's actually been a draft text shared just this week, which I think does move things on a little bit. There are major questions. I mean, the draft text is kind of amusing in some ways. It says, well, you know, climate finance will be provided, and then there's some square brackets, and one set of square brackets says more than 100 billion, and another set of square brackets says 2 trillion. So there's major things to resolve in that. I guess my argument would be, again, going back to what Natalie said about climate and development and getting rid of that silo. I really think particularly the developing countries should push for that to be a climate and development goal. And that way, the overall envelope you would be clear about whether it would grow. There's also the chance to specify a kind of grant equivalent figure there. And we'll be publishing some work in the coming days on what the baseline could and should be for that new goal. Again, going back to the last goal, there was no baseline. There was no understanding of the existing finance provided. So we have to do better than this. You know, this is the only internationally agreed goal on climate or development finance. I mean, you can argue about the 0.7% of GNI target, but this is the only current development finance target that's agreed, and we have to get it right. And we talked about and we touched a little bit on new providers as well. And I think that you know the world has changed a lot in the last 15 years. We were at one of the Bonn conference. We were listening to one of the discussions between countries, and the Saudi Arabian delegate said, well, you know, developed countries are still responsible for the majority of emissions, but actually that's changed in the last few years. If you look at all greenhouse gases emissions, developing countries are actually now responsible for the majority of cumulative historic emissions. And of course, there's a big variation. So as other panelists have said, you know, Africa's responsibility is almost zero. I mean, it's single percentage points. But the very large emerging developing countries are playing a big role in climate finance. It should be, of course, the developed countries in the lead. And I mean, I've made the argument through this whole piece that developed countries aren't stepping up or providing any more. But we've done some analysis which looks at cumulative historic emissions. We've adjusted ability to pay by GNI per head, and we think outside of the traditional providers, about 20% would be a good guide to what China and the big emerging economies could contribute of the total climate finance share. I think that probably looks like it would be voluntary, and there are some criteria in the text of the new climate goal, and I think that's a good debate to have. So I just guess just some final remarks. I mean, maybe we'll come on to de-risking a little bit. I guess I would urge caution on the ability to mobilize lots of private money. This has been something that, you know, everyone in development has tried to do for the last 20 years. There's a great article in the Financial Times today calling mobilization the magic pony. We're hoping for the magic pony of private finance mobilization, and we did it with, you know, 15 years ago, we talked about billions to trillions. It didn't happen. Now we're doing it again with climate. We've reviewed a lot of different private finance mobilizing instruments, and the amount they mobilize is modest. You know, it's about 50 cents for a dollar on the whole. It's not going to turn into multiples. I think what we need to do is focus on the policies that drive change. Maybe we can come back to some of those, as Natalie hinted. Carbon border adjustment mechanisms and carbon pricing is a very important one to get right, and I think the EU's great that it's leading, but it's not getting that right at the moment. There's things about intellectual property rights in trade agreements, and there's also a conversation to have about, again, Ibrahim talks about this, the quality of the climate plans we have in different countries, and whether they're investable, because actually, I mean, most of the NDCs are weak. They look like they've been put together by a consultant in 3 weeks, not a kind of all of society plan to change economies. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done in different areas, and I'm looking forward to discussing. Yeah, great question. I mean, I think maybe it's a chance to plug something Mark said earlier with the World Bank climate development reports. I missed a C out there. There's two C's in them, but I think they're a really valuable contribution. I guess where they need to evolve, they're part of kind of understanding the technological position and challenges in each partner country. But at the moment, they're quite well bank led, and really, I guess what every country needs is a more sophisticated, co-developed version of all of those reports to identify, where the investable opportunities are and what the needs are. I think that's one aspect of it. It's been interesting to hear Jorge talking about the potential for retaliatory tariffs. I mean, I've got a little bit of sympathy for that. Sometimes you hear about the idea of these climate clubs, and they always seem to include the US. And why would the US be in a climate club? It has 20 tons. Everyone in the US emits 20 tons per head. It's twice as much as Europe, or three times as much as Europe, twice as much as China. Um, and then you see this debate happening around the CBAM, which is to say, that the EU is showing leadership by implementing a carbon price and protecting its industry from countries that haven't got a carbon price. But then the way it manifests itself is that the EU finds itself taxing Mozambique, for example, when Mozambique's emissions per head are probably half a ton per head, and the EU's are 6 or 7. Everyone that works in CBAM industries in the EU probably drives to work in their car and has a gas boiler. And the people in Mozambique, that's absolutely not the case. And yet it's Mozambique that could be paying the EU for the emissions generated in its aluminium development. So I think the connection to your question on technology transfer is, what must the deal be in that situation? I mean, it must be that if you want to apply a CBAM universally to even the least developed countries, then surely it has to come with a great deal of financial and technical support for those countries. We've done a piece looking at the least developed countries and the low income countries, and how ready they are to implement a carbon price. And only one of those countries, which is the Ukraine, has a carbon price. I think about 4 or 5 have one under consideration out of 80 countries. And so the idea that these countries are in a position to implement a carbon price in time for the EU CBAM, I think is crazy. And I think, that we've written a piece on the EU, and my colleagues on the panel here, they with you there. I mean, the EU's got a great story to tell on climate and on climate finance. It's by far and away the most generous provider of climate finance globally. But I feel like it's getting these things wrong at the margin, and it's undermining that story. And we need to find a way for the technology transfer. I guess the other thing to say, I mean, we touched on this at the start of the panel. There is this question of ultimately private money will flow into climate when the technology means that renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. And so there needs to be a lot of energy dedicated to how we get to that point. And I think where bank colleagues, I'm not against private money. I mean, private money is what drives development. It's what we're all after. My skepticism is that public money can generate large multiples of private money. The public money would be better spent finding the pinch points in the technological progress that means that the renewables are not cheaper. And I think we're getting there. You see some people in the climate community say, oh, renewables are already cheaper. But I don't think once that is the case, we won't really have to worry about mobilizing private money. And I think we need to concentrate on unlocking those opportunities and breaking down those barriers in a very targeted way with the public money, because as Ibrahim has said, it's facilitate business and private finance, not to actually do it.
Thank you.